Warm greetings from the OSCE headquarters to all of you joining us from across and beyond our greater self. And, of course, welcome once again to The Third Way Live with the SG, our regular and more direct platform to exchange, discuss, and debate the challenges that lie ahead, as well as the opportunities that are already within our reach. Of course, as many of you will recall from last week's conversation, we explored what I fancied to term the political bankruptcy of the dichotomies. And of course, we reflected on how those frameworks that once defined political thought reached their limits. How left and right, progressive and conservative. I apologize to all of you. We seem to have a technical problem with the camera. Is it working now? Good. Yeah. But perhaps you can just move it a little bit. No, on the other way, because, yeah, other way. Other way, continue. Well, anyway, as I was saying, with my apologies for the technical issues we had earlier, as some of you will have witnessed, the camera fell, which caused me to jump out of worry. But in any case, let me cut back to the chase. As usual, I will address your questions and comments without filters, without intermediaries. But first, allow me to just share a few reflections before opening the floor as usual. Because as I was saying earlier, as many of you will recall from last week's conversation, we explored what I call, or have called, in a letter from the Greater South, the political bankruptcy of the dichotomies. And during that moment, as I was saying, we reflected on the frameworks that once defined political thought, how they have reached, in a certain sense, their limits, how left and right, as I was saying, how progressive and conservative, globalist and isolationist, all seem exhausted, no longer capable of explaining, let alone transforming our present reality. And of course, today, I would like to take that reflection a step further. Because if last week we diagnosed the exhaustion of the old, today we must begin, and I emphasize, begin to imagine and to build what comes next. And that next step, which will come to no surprise to those who have been following us for some time, is what we at the OSCE call the third way of development. But in saying the third way of development, perhaps let me start by clarifying what it is not, because I understand that it leads often to confusion. Because the third way of development is not a mere reconciliation, as we were discussing last week, between left and right, progressive and conservative. Nor is it an equidistant midpoint between opposing extremes. It is not a convenient balancing act designed to appease everyone, yet challenge no one. Nor is it an improvised big tent where contradictory positions coexist without purpose. And what it is certainly not, as I have written elsewhere and said elsewhere in speeches and in episodes, and of course in a letter from the Greater South, it is not a diluted broth that seeks to please everyone, but in fact nourishes no one. What we are proposing is something more ambitious and, indeed, more demanding. The transcendence of those dichotomies. not a reconciliation of doctrines, but a construction born from the realities and aspirations of our peoples. Not a compromise between opposites, but a synthesis that transforms them, that allows the very diversity of the Greater South to become our strength, our method, and a new Southern identity. This is not, my friends, ambiguity disguised as consensus, nor is it a universal model to be imposed without regard to context. The third way of development must serve as a powerful river in which multiple currents converge, flowing symbiotically, yet sovereign, towards an entirely new horizon. But how, one might ask, can such unity be achieved amidst so much diversity? After all, the Greater South is not, indeed, a monolith. Our cultures, our histories, and even our political sensibilities differ wildly, to say the least. And the answer to this question begins with a simple truth. Beneath our differences, there is a shared thread that binds us inexorably, a profound, almost visceral discontent with the current state of our world. A discontent that transcends ideology and geography alike. The Marxist, for obvious reasons, sees the structural injustices, the inequalities that persist in our societies. But so does the Schumpeterian capitalist, who observes that the entrepreneur's creative destruction, once a force of renewal, some would even say the genius of capitalism, has now been replaced by the sterile circulation of capital, where money generates more money without producing a single good, without creating a single job. Both recognize the same malaise, that productive dynamism has been replaced by financial accumulation, that creation has been replaced by concentration. And from this common recognition of the same problem by both ends of the political spectrum, a new clarity can emerge from the confusion. We may call it, perhaps, as I have often, the club of the dissatisfied, where we can all meet. But dissatisfaction alone is not a new horizon. It is only a starting point. Because to build a new world, we must channel that frustration, equip it with purpose, orientation, and leadership. Because the task of our era is to transform discontent into constructive action, into tangible agreements, into a shared project of transformation. And that is where the third way of development finds its meaning, to transform parallel frustrations into converging solutions. And for those of you who have followed these sessions of the Third Way Live with the SG since last year, it will come as no surprise that high value-added industrialization remains a central axis of our work at the Organization of Southern Cooperation. And this, I believe, is one of the great bridges that can unite us across the political spectrum and geography of our three continents. Now, can high value-added industrialization be achieved through the market? Certainly, if the market is wisely structured and oriented towards national development. Can it also be achieved through state-owned enterprises? Without a doubt, when they are well managed and socially grounded. But the essential point is this: within the third way of development, the debate over the preferred means, market or state or a mix of both, belongs to each nation, according to its historical trajectory, its own priorities, and the sensibilities of its people. What matters the most at the level of our Greater South is that the goal remains the same: to build prosperous, just, and sovereign economies, grounded in endogenous capacities, generating dignified employment, and creating value for our peoples. But our aspirations go beyond industrialization alone. We must pursue, as I have proposed in a letter from the Greater South, a stack of sovereignties, an interlocking foundation upon which genuine emancipation can stand and an authentic future be erected. We must strive towards epistemological sovereignty so that we may think from ourselves, by ourselves, and for ourselves. Ecological sovereignty so that the transition to a sustainable world becomes a source of shared prosperity and not a new green form of colonialism imposed from abroad. Technological sovereignty to ensure that we are not mere consumers of innovation, but producers and drivers of our own digital destinies. Educational sovereignty to align our systems of learning with our histories, our aspirations, and the needs, of course, of a rapidly changing world. In short, a transformed education that can, hence, become transformative. We must also endeavor to achieve cultural sovereignty, to allow our creative industries to become engines of integration and to project a living, evolving narrative of emancipation from the Greater South. Health sovereignty, to guarantee that human beings may live fully, body, mind, and who knows, soul, in harmony with their surroundings. And of course, food sovereignty, which goes beyond the right to eat, but ensures the right to eat well, revitalizing our rural economies, enhancing public health, and restoring dignity to our agricultural producers. We also need to achieve energy sovereignty, ensuring not only ecological planetary sustainability, but also industrial stability and affordable access for all of our peoples. And as I was mentioning earlier and have repeated countless times, economic sovereignty, moving us from exporters of raw materials to creators of value-added products and new industries. And of course, finally, infrastructural sovereignty, to connect our nations, facilitate trade, and make people-to-people exchanges no longer a distant aspiration, but a palpable, constant reality. And each of these sovereignties represents a pillar in the architecture of emancipation. Together, they form the scaffolding of a future where sovereignty is not, as I was mentioning last week, isolation, but a common project that conjugates strategic independence and synergetic interdependence on our own terms. Yet, vision by itself is not enough. As I think it was an Austrian Prime Minister that said, people who have visions belong in the asylum. Vision alone is crucial, but it is not by itself enough. It must be accompanied by will, and above all, by instruments. Because emancipation is not a proclamation. It is, so to speak, an engineering project. It is the deliberate construction of mechanisms that turn ideals into realities. But for that, we must understand at a fundamental level that we are no longer in a time when managing the existing order is sufficient. The present geopolitical moment, as fragile as it is fertile, demands that we build anew. We need committed collectives capable of pursuing transformation with endurance and with coherence. Now, yes, in the past, we have known collectives that suffocated the individual. Then, and this will not be a revelation for anyone, we entered an age of the individual king who trampled over the collective. Today, the task before us is to build collectives composed of individuals, where the rights and duties of both are harmonized, balanced, and mutually reinforced. And to that end, we must cultivate, as I was saying in one of the answers to the questions last week, authentic, active participation from all sectors, citizens as actors, not merely beneficiaries of change. And to do so, by achieving a mature equilibrium, participation that goes beyond procedural formality on one side, and leadership that goes beyond extraordinary egos on the other. We neither need saviors nor rudderless dispersal. What we need are participatory institutions where leadership and collective deliberation meet. What we need is a real political leadership instead of the technocratic management that we have known or the messianism that has often taken root, and authentic, constant participation instead of procedural Western liberal democracy that has proven to be a facade. And this equilibrium is necessary within each of our societies, in each of their own ways and forms, but it is even more urgent at the level of our greater South. For only then will South-South cooperation move beyond technocratic reports and ceremonial declarations and become tangible in the daily lives of our peoples. And to achieve this, we must design and strengthen structures that nourish the common good and irreversibly consolidate our collective sovereignty. And, of course, the Organization of Southern Cooperation is undoubtedly one such instrument. Its consolidation is not only desirable, it is essential. But it cannot, and it should not, stand alone. We must build more Southern institutions, and, chief amongst them, emancipatory financial bodies, capable of freeing us from the subordination to an international financial architecture that still dictates our budgets, constrains our choices, and perpetually delays genuine development. And as I have mentioned before, the OSC, under the mandate of our General Assembly, is working towards making the Greater South Development Bank operational. And this, of course, is a crucial step in the right direction. But it is only one step. We need additional financial mechanisms, economic leverage points that expand our investment in industrial and technological capacities. We must also ensure that our regional organizations, because as you will recall, I have always emphasized that South-South cooperation and regional integration mutually reinforce each other. We must ensure that our regional organizations, the African Union, the CELAC, ASEAN, the Arab League, and others, do not remain isolated islands, but form an archipelago connected by solid bridges. We must make them technically interoperable, strategically coordinated, and programmatically mutually reinforcing, in order to create a virtuous cycle of integration and cooperation. And all of this I have already spoken about in previous episodes, in a letter from the Greater South, and in other of my interventions. So I will not develop it further today. But before we open the floor to your comments, questions, views, which I will address as always without filters, allow me to add one more reflection, one that I have come to feel almost as a sore point, deeply. Because even as we build the instruments of transformation, we must also learn to communicate them. The OSC, first amongst equals, must become far more effective in conveying its vision, its initiatives, and its actions. For what is invisible cannot be connected, cannot inspire, and can certainly not transform. We must learn in the Greater South to tell our story, and not merely as a counter-narrative to the North, but as the narrative of a long-denied humanity that rises together from the South. Because once again, what is invisible cannot be mobilized, and what is not mobilized cannot transform. And it is in this context that I started, as some of you will recall, to hold these regular live streams. But today, I go a step further, calling all of you, especially our youth, to contribute your strength, your conviction, your determination to the endeavor, at the level of each of your communities and countries and regions, but also at the level of the OSCE. And this is why, in the upcoming weeks, I will announce a virtual OSCE Youth Forum to engage with you more directly, but for you to also contribute to this endeavor more directly. But in the meantime, I ask for your support in building and communicating our collective. Let us make our joint actions visible. Let's make our voice heard and let it resonate as the living sound of our own becoming from the Greater South. And with that, believing that I have confirmed my reputation as an interminable speaker, I, my dear friends, open the floor to your questions and your reflections. Now, remember that the questions can be dropped in the comment section of whichever platform you are following, but also, I believe, through WhatsApp. The number should be on your screens. Thank you. And may I ask you for a coffee? Thank you. So we have a question from Instagram, from Akampa Akankwasa. I apologize if I am mispronouncing. How do we involve ourselves into high value-added industrialization at a private level? My country, Uganda, has already started to drive into industrialization, though it's still falling into foreign hands. Well, I can't, very honestly, Akampa, make comments about the particularities of Uganda because I am not familiar with them. But what I can say is, of course, there is no universal recipe, as I was saying earlier, and there are multiple modalities to follow. One part which simply cannot be disregarded, and I know your question is about the private level, and I will get to it. But I also believe we have to be very careful in our endeavors, in our discourses, because over the past few years in development, a certain new discourse of entrepreneurship has taken hold. And of course, we value our entrepreneurs. We need more entrepreneurs. But there is a danger with this discourse that places entrepreneurship at the start and at the end and at the center. Why? Thank you very much, Betty. Why? Because entrepreneurship, as you rightfully say, is private. And there is a danger through that discourse of privatizing, individualizing success and failure. It is, to me, sometimes a repackaging of the very old narrative that if you are poor, it's your fault. And why do I say this? I say this because I ratify we need entrepreneurs, but we also need the role of our governments. We need the state to create the conditions that enable our entrepreneurs to thrive, to create. We need public policy that also directs foreign direct investment in the areas where we need them the most. And therefore, I want to start with this before getting to your question about the private level. We need our governments to articulate the right policies, and the OSCE works with the governments of the member states in that direction to ensure not only entrepreneur-friendly policies, but also to ensure that by working together at the multilateral level, we can, as I was mentioning last week, create OPECs of the South in strategic sectors, such as critical minerals that are necessary for the energy transition. And in doing this, we can demand, by working together, that foreign investors must, if they want access to those critical minerals, invest in the high value-added products that can be created in our soils, such as batteries instead of exporting raw cobalt, create jobs, provide capacity building for our peoples, and, of course, pay their due and fair share of taxes that can be used afterwards to reinvest in our entrepreneurs, in our private sector companies that seek to thrive in service of themselves, but above all in service of the nation. And, as I was mentioning earlier, we also need our governments to work collectively, and the OSCE is a platform for this, to work collectively towards negotiations with the tech giants that do not pay, as I was mentioning last week, any kind of tax within our countries, and use that fee that is collected through all of our countries into a Southern Innovation Fund that can invest, provide, because, our entrepreneurs also need, fundamentally, especially for entrepreneurs and startups, they need secondary markets, they need capital, they need the infrastructure to build economies of scale, and this is fundamentally a public function. But of course, until that time, are we to sit back, cross our hands, and say we are not the perpetually dissatisfied, we are the perpetually awaiting, those who wait for a tomorrow that never arrives? Of course not. No. At the private level, there are, of course, many initiatives that can and should be undertaken. As I was mentioning, and they already exist in many respects. And when I say they already exist in many respects, is because I recall, because you were mentioning, you are from Uganda, and you were mentioning the case of Uganda. I recall attending the coffee summit, a coffee summit that was held in Uganda. And in there, on the margins, I met with extraordinary young entrepreneurs from across the African continent. And I'm sure that if it had been a Southern coffee summit, it would have been equally true by finding entrepreneurs for Latin America and Asia that had already started companies in terms of high value addition in coffee. Now, mind you, why do I take the example of coffee? Don't worry, for those of you that have followed us for a long time, I will not explain why coffee is very important and it is the symbol of the South. I want to mention that high value addition, including industrialization, does not necessarily immediately need to start with the colossal projects that require billions of dollars of investment that might be out of reach of many of our entrepreneurs. It can start by working with our farmers, creating cooperatives to ensure, first, that they get a better share, that coffee is being processed in our countries, that is, getting processed coffee, not even yet capsules of coffee. And that in itself already contributes to a new value chain. And then, of course, have a plan of scaling at that level. But of course, with this, to scale, I go back to the role of the state, because everything is interlinked. Our future, the third way of development, will not be built only by our government, nor only by the private sector. It needs harmonization. We need also greater regional integration and visibility mechanisms that I was mentioning earlier. Because what good is it to produce high value added coffee or coffee with value addition, processed coffee in our countries, if nobody knows about it? And therefore we need to create the mechanisms, and the OSCE stands ready to support in those endeavors, of visibilization. We've done it with technology, with GRETFEST, the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technology, but I think there are other fora that must be created for our young entrepreneurs. I believe that this is overall what I could say in a very broad sense. Now, of course, if you are unhappy with any of the part of the question, feel free to ask a follow-up. I'll be delighted to take it up. I see from Facebook, Sydney Salmon. The extraordinary Sydney Salmon. Sydney Salmon, for those of you who don't know, an extraordinary singer, reggae singer, who lives in Shashamani, and who has participated time and time again in OSCE events, especially the Festival of the Greater South, with a dynamic of building bridges through culture, through music, through the arts between our peoples. So my greetings to you, Sydney Salmon. Well, I will read it as it is, protocol not observed. Inspirational as usual, Bro Bin Mussallam. Integration and cooperation indeed. Governments of the Greater South should be cooperating, working with the OSCE, implementing especially more youth programs. I entirely agree with you, but I also believe, as I mentioned towards the end of my introduction, that your role, Sydney, the role of our artists, of our intellectuals, the role of our youth who are creators, who are entrepreneurs, is crucial also in building those bridges between South-South cooperation. As I've said before, and I repeat it now, because until that reality changes, there is no reason not to repeat what has already been said, so long as it has not yet been done. And that is that, of course, agreements between our governments are essential. Without them, we cannot move forward. But also that the links between our peoples, through music, through trade, through education, even through student mobility, are more true, more authentic, and more sustainable than the agreements between governments. They last longer. They survive geopolitical cycles or even election cycles. And therefore, yes, I agree with what you say, Sydney, but I also emphasize that every single one of you, not just you, Sydney, but perhaps you first amongst equals, so that you lead by example. Each one of you is an actor of that transformation. I move on to another question from Facebook, from Henok Teshome Shibru. Your Excellency, in a letter from the Greater South, you emphasize the need for epistemic and economic sovereignty to truly achieve a third way of development. Given the structural dependency of many southern institutions on northern funding, how can organizations like the OSCE mobilize sustainable, autonomy-preserving resources while still engaging constructively with partners from the global north? What kind of cooperation model do you envisage that avoids reproducing the old hierarchies of aid and dependency? A crucial question, and one that perhaps will put me in, so to speak, hot waters, because in it there is also a critique. Because the truth is, I've said it in past episodes, 2025 has been a challenging year for the OSCE. It has been a challenging year budgetarily. Because, as I've mentioned at the very first episode, the tariffs announced by our friend Donald Trump has generated economic uncertainty across our countries that has led to delays from contributions of our member states. The dismantling of US aid has made it so that many of the functions of the state that had been delegated to projects financed by US aid are suddenly back into the responsibility of the state that did not have the budget allocations prepared to take over, which has also generated less fiscal space for our government. But of course, if the price of independence, to take our own decisions, to say what we believe, to implement what we are convinced is necessary, is challenges that occur in certain occasions, then we are ready to pay that price at any moment. Because the OSCE does not depend on external funding. Now, of course, in these circumstances, we are looking towards resource mobilization efforts. But resource mobilization with two variables that are crucial. Number one, resource mobilization in terms of our institutions of the South or our intergovernmental organizations cannot reach levels where our own countries do not finance the majority of the budget of their own organizations. When 70% of your funding comes from outside your member states, then this is no longer the organization of member states, whether we like it or not, because that dependency constrains actions. So resource mobilization by first limiting, putting a cap, and this is where political will is necessary, and sensibilization of our governments is crucial. And where, of course, the role of our peoples in demanding greater support for our institutions, regional and southern, becomes crucial. But then, of course, resource mobilization always with an understanding that the modality of cooperation that we seek to instill is one of a mutually beneficial partnership amongst equals. Nobody here is proposing, Henok, that somehow we want to become the new North, or that the North should be at a disadvantage. That is not our discourse, that is not our interest. We want the North to benefit. It is fair, but we want to benefit equally. We want to answer the aspirations of our people, and we want to respect and abide by the human dimension of development. But how to do that, you say, you ask? How to instill those modalities? Well, I think, and I mentioned this in a letter from the Greater South, the change of those dynamics have been so profoundly embedded within the international dynamics for so many decades, to not say more, that none of our countries will be able to change those dynamics unilaterally by bilateral negotiation. It requires an orchestrated, determined southern coalition of the willing. And here I believe that what we have been seeing since 2025 opens up an opportunity. The European Union is clearly becoming disenchanted with the current policies and geopolitical shifts of the United States. And in the face of that disenchantment, I think that the European Union has one of two choices. Either to choose protectionist withdrawal, or to renew and strengthen its cooperation with the rest of the world, with those that for too long it considered to be the periphery. And I believe, if not for principles, then out of economic interest, they will choose the latter option. But this requires us coming together in terms of the South, because we have to welcome that cooperation. We have to our project, our cause as the South has never been, as I've said before and I ratify, a cause against the North. we welcome any genuine interest to strengthen ties. But by coming together, we can also request and demand and ensure that these renewed, reinforced ties also come with a reset of the dynamics of the relation towards mutually beneficial partnerships. Towards, for instance, requests for greater investment, as I was mentioning coffee earlier, into coffee processing and capsule factories in our countries, rather than us only exporting green. So there are many modalities possible there. But of course, as I was saying earlier, we also need to create our own financial instruments. I mentioned earlier, I mentioned in other episodes, the Greater South Development Bank, but we need more of them. And as I've said before, it is simply not true that there is no capital in the South. There is plenty of capital in the South. What it lacks is strategic orientation to ensure that the investments go where they should. And in this regard, we need to create not just more financial institutions of the South in terms of investments, but there is a proposal that I made some years ago that was perhaps premature, to say the least. Because, you know, as I've always said, the worst crime in politics is not to be wrong. The worst crime in politics is to be right at the wrong time. And that proposal was, I think, right, but at the wrong time. But we need to leverage blockchain technologies, for instance, to enhance trade amongst our peoples, to reduce our dependence on foreign currencies. And we could even, I even had a name for it, Gressur. We even could create a digital Greater South Unit of Reserve, our own special drawing rights, against a basket of our own national currencies. Of course, that needs in parallel to be accompanied with the right investments. You need to make sure that there is enough trade amongst our peoples to make it relevant. But of course, all of these are avenues that can and should be undertaken without delay. Because it is not just the financial dependence of our countries that is really striking the South down. It is our dependence on foreign currencies that also drains our economies. Because it forces us to design the entirety and put the entirety of our economies in function of getting US dollars. That is, we no longer look at the high value-added industrialization that will enable us to achieve authentic development. Say again, capsules of coffee, right? If we start producing capsules of coffee, I do believe it's unlikely and it's not even desirable that the greatest market for them will be Switzerland. Why? Because there's already companies there that have a very strong market recognition. The real market is our neighbors, who might not be producing coffee by producing something else that we need. But of course, in doing that, what ultimately becomes an issue is, because we are focused on getting US dollars and our neighbor is also on a shortage of US dollars, we will not create that factory, we will focus on tourism. That, yes, is a good source of income, but tourism does not produce value, except with some occasional exceptions. And so, I think these are the avenues that we need to undertake in terms of the South. That is, to summarize what I said. One, we need to ensure that we are ready to pay the price as institutions of the South of sometimes facing challenges in pursuit of independence in decision-making. Second, we need to mobilize resources, but in a manner that never leads to ownership being stripped away from our own member states and becomes the ownership of the funders. Three, we need to create more southern financial instruments, to invest strategically in our countries where it matters the most, and that allows us in the medium term, not immediately, to supersede the structural deficiencies of our economies that generate our dependencies. Hence why I keep repeating about and talking again and again about this stack of 10 sovereignties, which are strategic sectors. And 3, we must leverage, as we invest in those sovereignty enhancing sectors, such as the infrastructure that connects our countries and therefore enhances trade, we need to start investing in the platforms, leveraging technology such as blockchain technology and tokenization processes to create a greater South unit of reserve, Gresur, backed by a basket of our currencies, our own special drawing rights, that could even go back to Keynes' proposal and serve as a unit of trade amongst our countries to reduce our dependency on foreign exchange reserves in this regard. This is what I could say in a very concise manner. But if it is concise or not depends on the eye of the beholder. But concise by my standards. Of course, if you want me to elaborate more, I'll be delighted. I see a question from WhatsApp from Diane. Dear Secretary General, thanks a lot for your inspiring and thought-provoking introductory presentation as always. My questions in that regard. Under the context of the third way of development of the OSCE, how do you evaluate the recent initiatives launched by the UN called as Sevilla Forum on Debt? What kind of synergies do you think may be found between the OSCE's club and the UN's initiative? How should these initiatives be translated into actions so that they can bear fruit, I assume? Thank you for this question, and I said I will answer the questions without filter, because I think that at one point, when one has too many filters, too many diplomatic niceties, one ends up saying nothing whatsoever. Number one, which is the starting point. The OSCE has always, and will always, stand ready to cooperate with all initiatives and all institutions, chief amongst which the United Nations, in service of our common endeavors. And of course, as you rightfully pointed out, I'll just mention what it is for those that may not know. The OSCE serves as the secretariat of the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, the club, as the world's first union of borrowing countries, debtor countries, in response to the need of greater borrower coordination, both to reduce debt burdens, but also to achieve fresh, highly concessional finance and mutually reinforcing capacity building amongst borrowing or debtor countries. Now, of course, this proposal, the club, was first made at our first General Assembly in December 2021, but it was finally adopted in terms of its bylaws in November 2023. And as you rightfully point out, the recent initiative from the Financing for Development, International Financing for Development conference that was held in Sevilla, in Spain, did reach an agreement on creating a borrowers forum, which is, to be specific, paragraph 48I of the agreement. It's the Compromiso de Sevilla, the Compromise of Sevilla. And of course, we celebrate any initiative that seeks to ensure greater borrower coordination. We do lament slightly, at least that is my firm position, that there was not greater coordination with the OSCE prior to the articulation of this, especially since one of the people who announced the initiative was the Secretary General of UNCTAD, who I personally met with in February 2023 here in Addis Ababa to present the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers. That is, I am sorry that there has not been greater coordination, especially since there is a platform that exists that should be reinforced, perhaps reformed, to have greater access to non-member states of the OSCE in terms of participation. But I do think that it is difficult to move forward when we constantly, whether out of inadvertence or for, let us be very clear, institutional rivalries that are fruitless, duplicate efforts, duplicate endeavors, and therefore divide up resources. Now, that being said, the compromiso was adopted, and our role and our determination is to ensure that it is a success. Because any success in borrower coordination is a success for our countries, which is a success for our endeavors of a third way of development. That being said, I understand as well, because there was last week, or 2 weeks ago, some important meetings in Washington with regards, in part, to making operational the borrowers forum mentioned in the Compromiso de Sevilla. And I understand that they are at very, very early stages. That is, there is no clarity on what the structure will be, the modalities of the chairpersonship of the committee that will, from countries, and so on and so forth. So they are at very early stages. We from the OSCE stand ready to support in perhaps also sharing our own experiences on how best to structure a borrowers club from our experience, that is, from what has clearly worked with the OSCE's club, but what also showed certain limitations or shortcomings in terms of the OSCE's club. Now, I also understand that the paragraph in question, paragraph 48I, specifically says that the secretariat of that forum should be a UN secretariat. So, of course, once it is identified which UN entity should be the secretariat, I wouldn't be surprised if it's UNCTAD. We will be delighted to work with that secretariat in order to also exchange notes and perhaps even identify joint positions that are mutually reinforcing. But at this particular stage, it's too difficult for me to give you the concrete areas of synergy between the Borrowers Forum that is in formation and the club, because they are very early in the process. That being said, my understanding is that the Borrowers Forum is far looser, so to speak, than the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers. That is, it really serves as a forum of exchange and general coordination, and does not yet have, perhaps it will in the future, mechanisms like in the club, the OSCE club, the Borrowers Club, that has existed since November 2023, for collective negotiations by consensus-based decision-making of the member states. That being said also, I firmly believe, because I understand that there was the presence in the announcement of a number of our northern partners, creditor partners, in the exchanges about the Borrowers Forum. And I do believe that we have to unashamedly say that of course we want to engage, and fruitfully, not confrontationally, with creditors. But prior to doing so, it is important for us to have a space like the OSCE Club, and we hope eventually this Borrowers Forum, this paragraph 48, that enables our countries to exchange in private without the immediate interference or points of view of creditors before going and talking with one voice. Otherwise, we risk doing what has already happened with the Cartagena Consensus in the 1980s, I believe, in Latin America, where some creditor countries came together to coordinate positions from Latin America and ended up, because of constant interference from our creditor partners in the early stages of conversation, that is, before positions have been articulated and views formulated, ended up breaking up without achieving much. And I think we have to have a consciousness, a historical consciousness, that the creation of the OSCE Club, but also this Compromiso de Sevilla, this paragraph 48I, are historic. What is on the line is not which intergovernmental institution will take the lead. Our role as institutions is to serve. And to serve a vision, to serve an ideal, to serve our countries, and through them, of course, to serve fundamentally our peoples and their aspiration for an authentic future. But we have, therefore, not to fall into the debate of who should lead the process. Besides, it should be led by our countries in any case. But also, crucially, we have to understand that this is not a light matter. If the OSCE Club, if this Borrowers Forum, and this is why I say now that this has been adopted, we stand ready to making it a success, fail, which we will do everything in our power to ensure that they do not. But if they fail, it is not just an initiative of the OSCE or this initiative from the UN that has failed. It is the very essence, the very idea, the very spirit, and belief in the possibility and desirability of borrower coordination that is on the line. And therefore, we have to work together to make sure that it is a success. Now, just because I realized I answered just two of your questions, I'll very quickly answer the last part of your question, which is how should these initiatives be translated into action so that they bear tangible results? And as I've said before, I think that always at the multilateral level, and this is the very essence of the creation of the OSCE as an intergovernmental organization of the South, with an executive secretariat. You need a secretariat with executive capacity to implement the decisions of the countries, to follow up, to accompany. That is one. Number two, you have to have a very clear framework, hence why the bylaws of the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers that were adopted in November 2023 took so long to get adopted. Perhaps not very long when you calculate that it only took perhaps less than 2 years to achieve. But it took a certain period of time because it was very important to ensure that all the countries, with their divergences, their differences, their priorities that are not always aligned, agree to a very well articulated framework, both for consensus building and for action taking. And in this regard, of course, when you take that into consideration, that is the need for a very clearly articulated framework of action, a clearly articulated framework for consensus building, we must also ensure that there is the necessary political buy-in and political will that accompanies it to then transform it into concrete action. And how do you ensure the political will? Because yes, there is plenty to say, as many have said for many years. There is, of course, the issue of sometimes hesitating political will out there. No need to speak about what everybody already knows. But also, it is the role of government to be cautious in service of its people at times, especially when it comes to the international financial architecture. And in this regard, how do you ensure that there is growing momentum and political will? By showing action. And I know it's very paradoxical how to translate this into action with action. But sometimes it is as simple as that. That is by taking the small steps that make countries see and gain confidence that it works. Yes, perhaps it is not particularly ambitious to start with. Perhaps it is a small amount of debt relief. Or perhaps it is not debt relief at all. It is just a small amount of new finance, but that is highly concessional and less conditioned, with longer maturities. And once these occur, countries gain confidence, political will grows. This is what I would say. Of course, if you are dissatisfied as part of the club of the dissatisfied with my answer, I will be delighted to develop further. Let me see if we have any more questions. Yes, there is one on YouTube from Shabzino. Love the work you and the team are doing. I'm a Somali diaspora born and raised in the West. I'm disillusioned by life here and want to return to the motherland. What do you suggest for someone like me? I don't want to come across with a Western-like savior complex and colonized mindset. How can I make tangible change and contribution whilst avoiding that? That, first, it's an honorable question, in addition to being a very important one. And look, I'm not going to hide behind grandiloquent speeches, and I spent a large part of my life in what you've termed the West, in Switzerland, in France, in London. That has not made me less South, I believe. It has enriched me, it has transformed me. I wasn't born there, of course, but still. And I think there is nothing wrong to have influences from Western thinkers, philosophers, or ideas even. There is nothing wrong there. But it is true that our greater South needs the support and the involvement of its diaspora. And therefore, that's why I said it's honorable, because I do salute your determination to go back home and contribute to development there. And I think part of the crucial parts, when it comes, not just in fact because you're coming from the north, it could be because you're coming from the capital city and you want to contribute to rural development. It to not arrive with preconceived ideas of what is needed. Of course, you should have ideas, debate them, exchange with them. But I would say, engage first. Discuss, meet your people, meet the rural people. Look at the initiatives that are already there. Hear the aspirations. And then it doesn't mean, because there is another, because you mentioned the white savior complex or Western savior complex. But there is another dimension to that is equally bad, I think, which is also where you suddenly disappear. So whatever everybody else says, so that you do not have that savior complex, you try to present as, yes, I entirely agree. My role is only to do what you say. No. It is to engage in genuine conversation. That is not arriving with preconceived decisions on what should be done. By going there, living there, engaging with people, and defending your own views, and be open to have your views changed. That is what I would fundamentally recommend. That is dialogue. But I say dialogue, not monologues crossing each other, savior complex. Neither lectures where you just breathe in everything that everybody says and accept it as fact. So this is fundamentally what I would say to you. And in the process, start walking. And what I mean by start walking, because I haven't quoted this in a long time, but there is this poem by Antonio Machado that says, "Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar." Wanderer, walker, there is no road, the road is made by walking. As you engage, as you start walking, as you start getting involved, as you might start an initiative or join an initiative, new pathways open up. I think that is, at a personal level, what is crucial. Then, of course, it is also a constant exercise of self-examination and self-doubt. I have here, because I didn't present them, but I have here Jim, I have here Fabian, I have Idrisi, Betty, Pearl, Annabelle, Kulshi, Hidayat. And I often ask them after a speech or after these live streams, what did you think? How did I do? And because I'm not happy with how I did. That is the honest truth. And they say, why? You're never happy with how you did. Yes, because I always say to them, the most critical person of Manssour Bin Mussallam is Manssour Bin Mussallam. The person that is the most critical of the Secretary General is Manssour Bin Mussallam, because that is the only way. You must always constantly exercise, but self-analyze. See whatever, perhaps at moments, without wanting to, almost as an automatic reflex, took steps that, yes, not only were wrong or were not well guided, but perhaps were in terms of intentions, misdirected. Did you fall into a certain level of arrogance at one point that made you stop listening to what people are saying? That is something that one has always to be on their guard. And of course, I am saying all of this, and I'm cringing almost, because I sound like a self-help book. And that is not my intention. I think human life is messy. What matters, and we try, each one of us, to navigate that messiness, to put order into that messiness. But what matters is, again, that you share a horizon with the South, that you share a horizon with your people, and that you have a commitment. And that is the crucial part, a commitment. Because what should not happen is this being a whim, or you expecting it to be easy. It will probably be very difficult. And it will imply a lot of sacrifice, because we have to abandon that feely-good narrative that came from self-help books from the United States. That is, you must love yourself first. Well, no, I don't know. The last time I checked, if you love yourself first and foremost, you're a narcissist or a psychopath. No, I am sorry to say. Yes, of course, you should not hate yourself. But if you want to contribute, you have to know how to love humanity, love your people. Because, and perhaps, again, the greatest endeavor is always stemming out of love. I know it sounds fluffy, but it is true. Because if you don't love enough, you won't be able to sacrifice. And this is applicable, and just to tell you, it's like in a relationship. If you don't love that person enough, your wife, your spouse, well, yes, you'll find it extremely difficult to compromise, sacrifice certain of the pleasures that you had or habits that you had to make it work. At the level of our greater self, at the level of our peoples, at the level of our countries and our communities, that love becomes all the more important because the sacrifice is all the greater. And the important part is, if it is true love, then the expectation, the hope, the aim is not to be celebrated or applauded. It's accepting that you might be actually disliked at times. But it is understanding that this is José Agustín Caballero, theologian, Catholic theologian, and thinker, philosopher from Cuba. Because everybody knows José Martí. Very few mention José Agustín Caballero. Who said, la doctrina del sacrificio es la madre de lo poco que somos. The doctrine of sacrifice is the mother of the little that we are. Now, I don't know if this will work for you. It is at least the philosophy that is mine. But what I can say is take the step, engage, talk, but above all, love and commit. I hope I've answered, even though it sounds a bit fluffy. If you find it unsatisfactory, well, I'll try to elaborate more. And I think I do not see any more questions for today, unless I am wrong. I see just Abraham Artab saying, hello, sir. Hello back to you, Abraham. I give you and send you a southern embrace. But by southern embrace, I mean the greater south, don't misunderstand. Anyway, as always, I am grateful for all of you that have joined us. I apologize for the start, where we had some technical problems at the very beginning, but at least you know, with those technical problems, that we are honest when we say it is live, and it is without filters and without intermediaries. So I just invite some of you not to go back and watch too intently the part where I am jumping because the camera is falling and my heart almost shattered at the cost it would take to replace it. That being said, I thank you all, and remember fundamentally that this endeavor This cause that is ours is not Manssour Bin Mussallam's cause, it's not the OSC's cause. As I say in a letter from the Greater South, the vision, the project that unites us, that brings us together, transcends any given institution or individual. It belongs to each one of you, to our peoples, to this collective endeavor composed of individuals, to the service of the ideal. And by belonging to each one of you, by belonging to our peoples, remember always that it is up to you, individually and collectively, one does not go without the other, to finally choose for our greater self, destiny or silence.
We have one question, if you want to address.
Well, I do apologize. It was a high-end note, I think. But I will still address a last question that might have come. On YouTube, I will address this, then we will wrap up. It's from Catherine on YouTube. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. I note with gratitude that you made time to meet and engage with the delegation from Kenya this month. Any insights you would be open to share with us on a shared path forward? Y si de acuerdo, el sur también existe. This is lovely, Catherine. Look, what I will say is I did indeed meet with a delegation from Kenya, which was a follow-up to my bilateral meeting with His Excellency the President on the margins of the Africa Climate Summit. And the principal aim of that exchange was, of course, to better explain what is the OSCE, because as I said in our introduction, we have to do better at explaining ourselves, communicating ourselves, but also understand the strategic direction of Kenya and how best the OSCE can possibly support. And of course, I met with the ambassador, a brilliant ambassador, I must say, from Kenya here in Addis Ababa, to explore those avenues. And what we identified is means we hope that will culminate sooner rather than later in Kenya taking its rightful place amongst full member states of the OSCE. And I say this because we fundamentally believe, for everything that we've already discussed, that the OSCE can support greatly the implementation, the development plans of Kenya, but we also believe that Kenya has a lot to contribute to our collective of nations, because that is the spirit of South-South cooperation, that is the spirit of the multilateralism that we seek to embody, that is not just vertical charity and aid, as was mentioned earlier, but no, a community of mutual learning amongst sovereign peers, amongst equals, that learn from each other, strengthen each other's initiatives. And this is where we are for now. But we also, of course, hope that you will support us in this endeavor as well. And since you mentioned in Spanish, for those who don't understand Spanish, at the end, Catherine closed with y sí, and yes, de acuerdo, I am in agreement. El sur también existe, the south also exists. Because this is a reference to a poem that I have mentioned in the past, that I will repeat here, by Benedetti, Mario Benedetti, the Uruguayan author, that said, y hay quienes se desviven y hay quienes se desmueren, y así entre todos logran lo que era un imposible, que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. That there are those who unlive and those who undie, and this way, amongst all of them, they achieve what was once thought to be impossible, that the entirety of the world may know that the South also exists. And that is why we need your involvement. Otherwise, it is silence that will answer what should be destiny. Thank you.